The first Saturday Lydia Wells set up her bread stall at the Harlan Creek market, she sold exactly nothing, and she smiled through every humiliating hour of it anyway. It was the spring of 1878, in the small but growing town of Harlan Creek, Colorado, perched at the edge of the San Isabel foothills, where the land was still wild enough to swallow a man whole if he wandered too far from the trail. The town had a post office, a feed store, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though it were listening for gossip, and a Saturday market that drew folks from 5 miles in every direction. Ranchers brought horses. Farmers brought corn and dried beans. The widow Pelham sold pies that were more lard than fruit and still managed to sell out by 10 in the morning. Lydia had come to Harlan Creek 6 months before that first market Saturday, arriving on the southbound stage from Denver with a single trunk, a cast-iron bread pan, and a situation that the polite residents of Harlan Creek described in hushed tones as unfortunate. Her husband, Gerald Wells, had died of a fever the previous autumn, leaving her with a small rented property on the edge of town, a modest sum of money that would last perhaps 8 months if she was careful, and no family within 400 miles. She was 26 years old, strong-shouldered, with dark auburn hair and green eyes that had a habit of seeing more than people expected, and she had decided, quietly and firmly, that she was not going to fall apart. She had learned to bake bread from her mother back in Missouri, and her mother had learned from her mother, and the bread those women produced was something that went beyond simple nourishment. It was dense and golden, with a crackling crust and a soft, warm interior that smelled of wood smoke and something sweet underneath, and people who ate it tended to close their eyes for a moment, as though they needed to concentrate on the experience. Lydia had spent her 6 months in Harlan Creek practicing, adjusting recipes for the altitude, learning which flour the Harlan Creek General Store stocked, and how it behaved differently from what she had used in Missouri. She had baked dozens of loaves that she had given away to neighbors, to the preacher, to the school teacher, to anyone who might form an opinion, and the opinions had been uniformly enthusiastic. So she had arrived at the market that first Saturday morning with 12 loaves wrapped in clean cloth, a hand-painted wooden sign that read Wells Bread, and a confidence that was built on solid evidence. By noon, not a single loaf had sold. She had watched the widow Pelham stall from the corner of her eye and seen the steady trickle of customers, the easy way money changed hands, the nodding familiarity between seller and buyer. Lydia had no such familiarity. She had spoken to the customers who paused near her stall. She had offered samples. She had smiled in a way that was genuine and warm without being desperate, and still they had drifted away, back toward things they already trusted, toward faces they already knew. A woman alone was a curiosity in Harlan Creek. A woman alone trying to build a business was something people weren't entirely sure how to respond to. She had loaded all 12 loaves back into her wagon that afternoon and driven home with her jaw set and her shoulders straight, and she had sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she decided that next Saturday she would be back. Seth Vaughn had been working the Caldwell Ranch for 3 years, which was long enough to know every fence post on the property, and short enough that he still noticed the beauty of the land when the light hit it in the early morning. He was 29. Lean and deliberate in the way of men who have spent years doing physical work, not because they had no other option, but because they genuinely preferred the life of open sky and honest labor. He had grown up in Kansas, come to Colorado after a couple of years of drifting, and found in Harlan Creek something that felt close to belonging without being so settled that it made him restless. He rode into the Saturday market that first morning looking for a new set of saddlebags from the leather worker who set up near the water trough, and he saw Lydia Wells's stall from 30 feet away. He noticed her before he noticed the bread because she was standing very still in the midst of all the movement and noise of the market, and there was something in that stillness that arrested his attention. She wasn't defeated. She was patient. There was a difference, and Seth Vaughn had lived long enough to know it. He walked past her stall twice before he stopped. He wasn't sure why he walked past the first time. Maybe he needed a moment to think about what he was doing. He stood in front of the hand-painted sign and looked at the loaves on the table, wrapped in their careful cloth, and then he looked at Lydia, who met his gaze with the directness of a woman who had decided long ago not to look away from things. "How much for a loaf?" he asked. 10 cents, she said. He bought one. She thanked him. He walked away without looking back, because looking back would have changed the nature of what he'd done, and he wasn't ready for it to be a thing with meaning attached to it yet. He ate the bread that night in the bunkhouse at the Caldwell Ranch, tearing off a piece and expecting nothing extraordinary, and then stopping completely because it was extraordinary. It was the kind of bread that made you realize you had been eating bread your whole life without quite understanding what it was capable of. He ate half the loaf before he consciously decided to stop himself. The following Saturday he arrived at the market before it was fully set up, before most of the vendors had arranged their goods, and he tied his horse at the post nearest to Lydia's stall and waited. He watched her arrive in her small wagon, watched her set up the table with its cloth and sign, watched her arrange the loaves with the careful attention of someone who believed that how you presented things reflected who you were. And then, before anyone else had the chance to approach, he walked over. She looked up and recognized him, and something in her expression shifted just barely, as though she was recalibrating. "You're back," she said. "I'll take 2, he said. "And 2 more if you have them." She looked at him steadily. "That's half my inventory. I know. I have a bunkhouse full of cowboys who have been eating whatever the cook throws together for 3 years. I think they deserve better." That was true, and it was also a convenience of explanation that Seth appreciated for its cleanness. He paid for 4 loaves and went and sat on the fence by the water trough where he could watch the market without appearing to watch any specific part of it. By the time the morning was half over, Lydia had sold her remaining 8 loaves to other customers, customers who had seen a man buy 4 loaves with evident intention and had been curious enough to investigate. The widow Pelham had stalled at about her usual pace across the way. Seth noticed, as he remounted his horse to ride back to the ranch, that Lydia was smiling in a way that was different from the careful, sustained smile she had been wearing when the morning started. This one broke through on its own. He wasn't sure exactly when the quiet habit formed itself into something deliberate. It might have been the 3rd Saturday, when he arrived, and the market was busier than usual, because a supply wagon had come through from Pueblo, and people had heard about it and come from further out. And he saw 2 women examining Lydia's bread with interest, but also with the particular calculating look of people who were deciding whether to spend money on something unfamiliar. And he stepped forward and bought 3 loaves before they could put them back down. And the women, startled, immediately became more interested in what had apparently just become desirable. It might have been the 4th Saturday, when it rained and only half the vendors showed up, and the handful of customers who braved the mud walked quickly past Lydia's stall. And Seth stood under the overhang of the feed store across the way and watched her stand in the drizzle with her bread covered by an oilcloth and her chin up. And he walked over in the rain and bought everything she had, and didn't make it a transaction so much as a conversation, asking her about the different types of loaves she had brought, asking about the process, and she talked about bread with the warmth of someone talking about something they loved, and the rain came down around them, and it was the longest conversation they had had. But the thing that made it conscious and deliberate, the thing that made Seth acknowledge to himself that what he was doing had a reason that went beyond bread and bunkhouse morale, was the Saturday in early summer when he was delayed at the ranch by a problem with a water pump that needed fixing before the cattle could be properly watered, and he arrived at the market late, near midday, and found Lydia at her stall with 6 loaves still on the table, and a look on her face that she was working hard to conceal behind the same patient steadiness she always wore, but which Seth could read by then, which was the look of someone counting the hours until they could go home and be honest about how The day had gone. He bought all 6 loaves without pause, without preamble, just walked up and said, "I'll take whatever you have left," and put the money down before she could suggest that he didn't need 6 loaves of bread. She looked at the money on the table and then looked at him. "You do this every week," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I like your bread," he said. "You like my bread," she repeated slowly, as though she were testing the weight of the sentence and finding it lighter than what it would need to be to explain the facts. "Seth Vaughn, have you ever in your life told a woman something that was completely honest and also completely incomplete at the same time?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, but I'm working on the second part." She looked at him for a long moment, and the market moved and hummed around them, and then she picked up the money and put it in her apron pocket and said, "You can come by the house for supper on Thursday if you want to work on it somewhere quieter than a market." He said he would be there. He spent the 4 days between that conversation and Thursday in a state that the other hands at the Caldwell Ranch found entertaining, because Seth Vaughn, who was reliably even-tempered and unremarkable in his moods, was visibly somewhere else. He did his work with the same competence he always did, but there was a distracted quality to him, a kind of internal preoccupation that old Pete Aldridge, who had worked ranges for 30 years and could read a man the way he could read weather, identified immediately. "You've got the look," Pete said one afternoon, not looking up from the harness he was oiling. "What look is that?" Seth said. "The one where a man realizes he's already decided something but hasn't said so out loud yet." Seth didn't answer, which was as good as answering. He rode to Lydia's property Thursday evening as the sun was going down behind the foothills, the sky layered in orange and purple, the smell of pine and evening grass coming off the hills. Her property was modest, a small house with a vegetable garden along the south wall that was producing well, a single-door barn just large enough for 1 horse and some storage, and smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, welcoming column. He tied his horse at the post by the gate and knocked at the front door, and she answered it in a clean dress the color of sage, with her hair pinned up but loosely, and the smell that came out of the house behind her was the smell of his Thursday dreams, which was to say bread and roasting chicken and something with cinnamon. "You found it," she said, stepping back to let him in. "You gave good directions," he said. The house inside was small and arranged with the particular intentionality of a person who did not have much space and had thought carefully about every inch of it. The table was set for 2. There was a lamp burning on the sideboard. She had put wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill, yellow ones he didn't know the name of, and he noticed them the way you notice something that tells you more about a person than they might have intended. They ate and talked, really talked, in the way that 2 people who have been conducting a conversation in fragments across weeks of Saturday mornings finally sitting down and allowing it to be continuous. He told her about Kansas, about his parents who were still alive and farming, about the years of drifting before he found the Caldwell Ranch, and something that felt close to right. She told him about Missouri, about her mother's kitchen where the bread had always been the center of things, about Gerald, honestly and without theater, because he had been a decent man and she had genuinely mourned him and was genuinely past the mourning now, and she did not intend to carry it as a permanent condition. "I am not looking to be rescued," she said at one point, pouring coffee with the same directness she brought to everything. "I want to be clear about that. I built this myself and I intend to keep building it. I know that," he said. "I'm not here about rescuing anyone." "Then what are you here about?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at her. "I think you already know, but you asked me to work on the second part, so I'm working on it." The color that came into her face was very slight, just enough to tell him that the answer landed the way he'd meant it. "All right," she said. "Take your time." He did not take very much time after that. The following Saturday he was at the market before dawn, and he helped her carry her table from the wagon to the spot she always took near the big cottonwood at the edge of the market square, and she didn't ask him to do it, and he didn't make a pronouncement about doing it. He just did it, and she let him without making it into something complicated. He bought the first 2 loaves before the market opened, which had become a pattern by now, a pattern that some of the regular market-goers had noticed and were privately amused by. Clara Hoffman, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store and had the institutional memory of a courthouse, told her husband that Seth Vaughn was buying up the widow Wells's bread every Saturday like a man on a mission. Her husband, not a romantic, asked if she thought the bread was actually that good. Clara said she thought the bread was excellent, and also that it was not entirely about the bread. The widow Pelham, from across the market square, watched Seth Vaughn standing at Lydia's table, talking about something she couldn't hear, and smiled to herself in the manner of a woman who has seen the pattern before and knows how it ends. On a Wednesday afternoon in July, Seth was riding the fence line on the eastern edge of the Caldwell property when he saw a plume of smoke rising from the direction of the town, thick and dark, the kind that meant something serious. He kicked his horse into a run and covered the 2 miles to the edge of town in short order, and found that it was the bakehouse, the small outbuilding attached to Lydia's property where she did most of her large-scale baking, that was burning. He arrived to find Lydia standing in the yard with a bucket, but the bakehouse was already beyond buckets. 2 neighbors were there, the Hendersons from next door and old Milo Crane from across the street, and they had managed to create a firebreak between the bakehouse and the main house that was holding, but the bakehouse itself was going to be gone. Seth dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, tied the reins to the garden fence in one motion, and ran for the water pump. They saved the house. The bakehouse was ash and black timber by the time the fire was out, and the 3 bread pans Lydia had stored inside it were warped and useless, and the 50-pound sack of flour she had bought just 2 days before was ruined, and the look on her face as she stood before the wreckage in the evening light was the first time Seth had seen her look genuinely broken. Not destroyed, just broken. It was a specific thing and it required a specific response. He stood beside her without speaking for a while. The Hendersons had gone back inside. Old Milo Crane had offered his condolences and gone home. The evening was quiet now except for the occasional pop of something cooling in the ruins. "I can rebuild it," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was being maintained by effort. "I know you can," he said. "I have some money, not quite enough, but I can manage something smaller." "I can help with the building," he said. "I know how to build. Give me 3 Sundays and some lumber." She turned and looked at him. "I told you I'm not looking to be rescued." "I'm not rescuing. You'd be paying for the lumber and the materials. I'm just giving you my Sundays, which are mine to give to whoever I want." She was quiet for a moment, and in the ruins of the bakehouse, a beam settled with a soft, final sound. "All right," she said. "I'd appreciate the help." He was there the following Sunday morning at 7 with a borrowed wagon and Pete Aldridge, who had offered without being asked when Seth mentioned it at the bunkhouse the night before, because Pete Aldridge had always had a soft heart under the weathered exterior, and also because he wanted to meet the woman who made the bread that Seth would not stop talking about. They spent the morning clearing debris and the afternoon measuring and planning, and Lydia fed them both at midday, and Pete ate his food in the manner of a man eating excellent food, and afterwards said quietly to Seth while Lydia was inside washing the dishes, "I understand now." "Understand what?" Seth said, unnecessarily. "Why you buy all the bread," Pete said, and went back to measuring. The bakehouse went up over 3 Sundays, as Seth had promised. It was smaller than the original, built from good pine lumber, and with a better draft for the oven, which Seth knew about because he had thought to ask an old mason in town named Garrett who had been building ovens and hearths in the county for 20 years. The new bakehouse had a stone foundation and a chimney that drew cleanly and walls that would not catch so easily. And on the 3rd Sunday, when they laid the last of the roof shingles, Lydia stood in the yard looking at it with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "It's better than the first one," she said. "A lot of things get better the second time," Seth said, and he had not entirely meant it as anything other than a remark about construction. But the way she looked at him suggested she had heard the other meanings too, and found them acceptable. The first Saturday Lydia baked in the new bakehouse, she came to the market with 16 loaves instead of 12, because the new oven ran more efficiently, and she had been able to do an extra batch. Seth arrived early, as always, and bought the first 4, as always. And there was in the transaction now a warmth and an ease that had nothing to do with the commercial exchange at all, a kind of conversation conducted in the language of habit and familiarity. He lingered at her stall longer than usual that morning, helping her deal with a small rush of customers that came through all at once when the preacher's wife stopped and bought 2 loaves and said loudly that Lydia's bread was the finest in the county, which was the kind of endorsement that moved product quickly. When the rush subsided, Lydia leaned against the table and looked at Seth with a particular expression he had been learning to read. "I have a question," she said. "All right. Did you buy bread from me on the Saturdays when I wasn't selling out, specifically so that I wouldn't be standing here at the end of the day with loaves left over?" He did not look away. "Yes," she absorbed this. "From the beginning. After the first time I tried the bread," he said, "which was the first week." "So you never thought the bread needed help? You thought I needed help? I thought you deserved better than going home with a full wagon," he said. "And I thought the hands at the bunkhouse needed better bread." Both things were true. She looked at him for a long time. The market moved and hummed, and a horse whinnied somewhere nearby, and the smell of pine and dust and summer hung over everything, and she said, "Seth Vaughn, that might be the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time, and you did it quietly without telling me, and you've been doing it for months." "I didn't want to make it into a charity," he said. "It wasn't charity. It was just that I knew the bread was good, and I knew it would find its customers, and I wanted to make sure you were there when it did." She reached out then and put her hand over his where it was resting on the table, just for a moment, just briefly, and then withdrew it, and the touch was so deliberate and so gentle that it settled into Seth Vaughn's chest and did not move again. "Come for supper Thursday," she said. "I'll be there," he said. The relationship between Seth Vaughn and Lydia Wells was not the kind that announced itself dramatically or demanded that the town take a position. It developed the way good things in the natural world develop, steadily and with good reason at each stage, visible to anyone who cared to look but not performed for anyone's benefit. By midsummer, they were well understood in Harlan Creek as 2 people who were together in everything but the formal declaration of it, and most people regarded this with warmth, though not everyone. Dale Hutchins, who owned the feed store and had had the thought himself of calling on Lydia Wells when she first arrived in town, made his feelings about Seth Vaughn known in the Copper Spur one evening, in a way that involved enough whiskey and volume that it reached the ears of half the town by morning. He suggested that Seth Vaughn was a cowhand with no property and no prospects, and that Lydia Wells was making a mistake in her judgment if she thought otherwise. Seth heard about this the following day from Pete Aldridge and said nothing. Lydia heard about it from Clara Hoffman at the general store and said, with admirable clarity, that Dale Hutchins was welcome to his opinions about her judgment, and that her judgment was her own business. Clara Hoffman reported this back around town with the enthusiasm of a woman who appreciated a clean response. Seth did not confront Dale Hutchins. He considered it and decided it would accomplish nothing useful and potentially cause a mess that would embarrass Lydia. And he had no interest in embarrassing Lydia for the sake of satisfying his own temper. What he did instead was go and talk to Joseph Caldwell, who owned the ranch where he had been working for 3 years, and who Seth had long known was considering expansion. Joseph Caldwell was a broad, quiet man of about 50 who had built the Caldwell Ranch from a quarter section into a substantial operation over 20 years of hard work and good sense. He and Seth had always gotten along in the way of 2 people who respect each other's competence without needing to discuss it. Seth sat down with him one afternoon in the ranch office and told him he was interested in a different arrangement, Not just wages but a share in the operation, a foreman's role with an equity stake, if Caldwell was willing to discuss it. Caldwell looked at him for a long time and then said he had been thinking about raising the question himself because he was getting older and his son had no interest in ranching. They talked for the better part of 2 hours, and when Seth rode back to the bunkhouse that evening, he had the beginnings of an agreement that would, over a few years, give him something considerably more substantial than a cowhand's wages. He did not tell Lydia about this immediately. He wanted it to be actual and not just discussed before he said anything, because it was the kind of thing that should be presented as a fact and not a plan. What happened first, instead, was the fair. Harlan Creek held its annual county fair in August, 3 days of competitions and music and commerce in the field behind the church, and it was the social event of the year for the town and the surrounding ranches and farms. Lydia had entered the bread competition with what she called her best loaf, a honey wheat with a particular technique of scoring the top in a pattern that was as much about beauty as about allowing the crust to expand properly. She had been preparing for it with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Seth escorted her to the fair on the opening morning, which was as close to a public declaration as either of them had yet made, and which the population of Harlan Creek received with a collective satisfaction. They walked together through the exhibits and the stalls, and Seth bought her a paper cone of roasted corn from a vendor, and she ate it with a complete lack of self-consciousness that he found entirely wonderful. And they watched a demonstration of rope tricks by a boy of about 12 who had the kind of talent that was going to take him somewhere. And they stopped at the livestock exhibit where Pete Aldridge had entered his own horse in the working horse category and was standing nearby with an expression of studious indifference that fooled nobody. The bread competition results were announced midday. Lydia won. Not just a ribbon in her category, but the best in show for the whole food competition, which included the Widow Pelham's pies, which had won for 4 consecutive years. The judge, a visiting food merchant from Pueblo who had been chosen specifically because he had no local loyalties, said that the honey wheat loaf from Wells Bread demonstrated a mastery of technique and a depth of flavor that was genuinely remarkable, and that in 30 years of sampling regional bakery, he had rarely encountered anything better. The Widow Pelham was briefly not gracious about this and then visibly corrected herself and became gracious, which Seth respected, because correcting yourself in public when you don't feel like it is a form of dignity. Lydia accepted the ribbon and the small prize money with a composure that only broke when she was back beside Seth, where she grabbed his arm with both hands and said, quietly and fiercely, "I won." "I know," he said. "I never doubted it. I know you never doubted it. That's part of why I wanted to tell you first." He looked down at her hands on his arm and then at her face, and it seemed to him that there were conversations you could have with words and conversations you could have otherwise, and that they were in the middle of one of the latter kind. "Lydia," he said. "Yes," she said before he had said anything else. They looked at each other. "I would like to say some things to you properly," he said. "Not at the fair with half the county watching. Would you sit with me somewhere quiet tonight?" "Yes," she said again, and released his arm, and the afternoon continued around them with its noise and its color and its dust and its life. That evening they sat on the porch of her house as the fair sounds drifted faintly through the warm night air from the field behind the church, and the lamp inside cast a yellow rectangle on the porch boards, and the hills were dark silhouettes against a sky full of stars. Seth had thought about how to say this. He was not a man who spoke easily about the interior of himself, not because there was nothing there, but because he had been raised by people who believed that what you felt was demonstrated in what you did, and he had trusted that way of communicating for most of his life. But he had come to understand, through Thursday suppers and Saturday mornings and 3 Sundays of building a bakehouse, that Lydia Wells was a woman who deserved words as well as actions, who was perceptive enough to read actions but careful enough to want the confirmation. "I have been in Harlan Creek for 3 years," he said, "and for most of that time I thought I understood what I was doing and where I was going. And then you arrived and set up a table at the market, and I tried your bread, and I knew that something had changed, and I spent several months buying loaves of bread as a reason to be near you before I had the courage to be honest about the reason." She was looking at him with her full attention the way she always did. "I talked to Joseph Caldwell about a different arrangement at the ranch," he continued. "Foreman's role, equity stake. It will take a few years to build into something substantial, but it will be something. I'm not a man without prospects, whatever Dale Hutchins says about it, and I wanted you to know that before I said what I want to say." "Seth," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to marry you, and I want to keep helping you build your bread business into something that the whole county knows about. And I want to sit on this porch with you on evenings for a very long time, and I want the Saturday market to be something we go to together. That's what I want. And I understand if you need time, and I'll wait as long as you need." She was quiet for a moment that was long enough to make his heart work harder than it had been. "I don't need time," she said. "I've been watching you since the first Saturday you came to my stall and bought a loaf of bread without being asked. I've been watching you buy bread so that I wouldn't go home with a full wagon and build me a better bakehouse than the one I lost, and stand next to me when things were hard without making it into a production. I know what kind of man you are, Seth Vaughn. I've known for a while. Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes," she said, and she said it with a laugh that was warm and real and completely without reservation, and it was the best sound he had heard in a long time. He took her hand, and they sat on the porch as the stars moved and the distant fair sounds died away one by one, and the lamp burned inside, and the dark hills stood around them patient and enormous, and they talked until very late about everything and nothing, the way people do when they have been holding a great deal in and are finally allowed to let it out. They announced the engagement the following Saturday at the market, which was to say they arrived together, and Seth stood at Lydia's stall the whole morning, and Clara Hoffman took one look at them and said, "Oh, finally," loud enough that the nearest 3 vendors heard it, and the information radiated outward through the market in the efficient manner of small-town social intelligence, reaching the far corner where the livestock were tethered before the morning was half over. Pete Aldridge heard about it and went directly to the Copper Spur to buy himself a whiskey in celebration, which was not something he normally did before noon, but he felt the occasion justified it. Dale Hutchins heard about it and had no public comment, which was the only dignified response available to him, and to his credit he took it. The widow Pelham stopped at Lydia's stall and bought 2 loaves and said, with the genuine warmth of a woman who did not hold grudges about bread competitions, that she was very pleased for them both, and that Seth Vaughn was a good man and Lydia Wells deserved one. They were married in October, a month before the first snow, in the leaning church on the main street of Harlan Creek, which the congregation had been meaning to straighten for years and somehow never got to. The church was full. The preacher, who had been eating Lydia's bread for free for a year and considered himself indebted, gave a sermon about the virtue of quiet constancy that was so clearly directed at the groom that Seth heard Pete Aldridge suppress a laugh in the second pew. Lydia had made the wedding cake herself, which was also bread in her conception of it, a rich, sweet braided loaf decorated with dried flowers and glazed with honey, and everyone at the reception held in the churchyard afterward agreed that it was the finest thing they had ever eaten. The widow Pelham said this with a graciousness that Lydia returned in full, and the 2 women found themselves standing at the table together for a while, talking about flour and temperature and the particular challenges of baking at altitude, and it was the beginning of a friendship. Seth and Lydia moved together into her house, which was not large but was thoughtfully arranged, and they began the work of building a life together the way practical people do, one thing at a time, with attention and without drama. Seth took the foreman's role at the Caldwell Ranch, and learned it with the same steady competence he brought to everything. Lydia continued her bread business, expanded it through the winter with an arrangement she made with the general store to carry her bread 3 days a week, and by the following spring, Wells Bread had a reputation that extended well beyond Harlan Creek to the surrounding settlements. The injustice of what a woman alone faced in building a business, the particular wall of assumption, and doubt that Lydia had walked into on that first Saturday at the market, did not go away because she was now married. There were still men who addressed questions about the business to Seth even when Lydia was standing right there. Still women who assumed she baked for pleasure and not for income. But Lydia had the habit of calm, direct correction, and Seth had the habit of making sure any correction she offered was heard, and together they made a front that was quiet and immovable, and over time the town adjusted. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was harder than usual. The cold came early and stayed long, and the supply wagons from Pueblo were delayed twice by heavy snow on the passes, and there were families on the outlying farms who were genuinely short of provisions by February. Lydia organized what she called a community bake, enlisting 4 other women in town to help her use the new bakehouse for 2 days running, producing bread for distribution to the families who needed it. Seth and 2 other ranch hands from the Caldwell operation drove it out by wagon. It was done without announcement and without expectation of credit, which was why people remembered it. In the spring of 1879, Lydia discovered she was expecting and told Seth one evening in the bakehouse while she was checking the dough that was rising in its pans, turning to him with the kind of certainty in her face that preceded important news. He was quiet for a moment, standing in the warm bakehouse with the smell of bread around them and the evening light coming orange through the small window. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was the first thing. "I'm well," she said. "Very well, actually. I wanted to tell you here where it's warm." He crossed the bakehouse in 3 steps and held her carefully and completely, and she let him, leaning into it with her hands against his chest. "A baby," he said. "In October, I think," she said. "October," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even through his chest. The pregnancy was unremarkable in the best sense. Lydia continued to bake through most of it, making adjustments as her body required, and the regulars at the general store grew fond of the sight of her at the counter delivering her weekly supply with the same brisk efficiency she had always brought to the transaction, her apron modified as the months went on. The women of Harlan Creek rallied around in the practical way of frontier communities, where everyone understood that isolation could be genuinely dangerous, and Lydia accepted help with her characteristic clarity, knowing what she needed and what she didn't. The child was born on an October morning, a boy, strong and loud about his opinions from the first moment, and the doctor who delivered him said he was as healthy as any baby he had seen in the county. They named him Thomas, after Seth's father, and also after a kind of decisiveness that the name implied, which suited the child they had made. Seth held his son for the first time in the small bedroom of the house in Harlan Creek, sitting in the chair by the window with the October light coming in and Lydia watching from the bed with an expression of exhausted, complete satisfaction. And he thought about the particular path that had led to this moment, the Saturday mornings and the quiet purchase of bread, and the building of a bakehouse and the porch and the stars, and how none of it had been inevitable, and all of it had been the result of small, deliberate choices, which was how the best things were usually built. "He looks like you," Lydia said. "He looks like himself," Seth said. "I hope he stays that way." "He will," she said. "We'll see to it." Thomas Wells Vaughn grew into an early walker and a constant talker, and a child who had his mother's green eyes and his father's particular quality of stillness in the midst of movement, which is to say he could run and shout, and generally cause the productive chaos of small children, and then suddenly stop completely and look at something with an absorbed attention that seemed older than his years. He loved the bakehouse in the specific way of children who grow up in a place where something is made, loving not just the product but the process, the transformation, the way raw things became something else. By the time Thomas was 2, the bread business had expanded again. Lydia had taken on a helper, a young woman named Rosa Martinez, whose family had come to the Harlan Creek area from New Mexico, and who had the same instinctive understanding of fermentation and texture that Lydia had been born with. Rosa had been treated with the particular dismissiveness that was the fate of many Mexican families in the American West in that era, and Lydia hired her at fair wages, and said clearly to anyone who raised an eyebrow that Rosa's skill was excellent and her character impeccable, and that the conversation was closed. Seth reinforced this in the unverbal but unmistakable way he had, which involved looking at whoever had raised the eyebrow with a quiet steadiness that made the eyebrow come back down. Rosa proved to be not just a skilled baker, but a woman with her own ideas about flavor, bringing techniques and spices that had no precedent in Lydia's Missouri tradition, and that opened up new possibilities. The first loaf she made with dried chili and honey was the subject of considerable town debate for a week, and then became one of the most requested items in the inventory. The arrangement with the general store grew into a formal supply contract, and then Clara Hoffman's husband, who had business interests in 2 neighboring towns, suggested an expansion of the contract to those markets. Lydia considered this carefully, talking through the logistics with Seth over several evenings at the kitchen table, weighing what it would require against what it would return, and eventually decided to take it on with Rosa as a full partner. "You're sure about the partnership?" Seth asked, not because he doubted it but because he wanted to know her reasoning. "Rosa deserves it," Lydia said, with the simplicity that indicated the matter was fully settled. "She's built this as much as I have. Half the ideas in that bakehouse are hers now." Seth nodded. "Then it's right." And it was right, and the business grew on that rightness. 2 women who understood what they were doing and were given the space to do it, which was still unusual enough in 1880 that people sometimes came from the neighboring settlements not just for the bread but to see the operation. And Lydia and Rosa received these visitors with equanimity and bread samples and went right back to work. The Saturday market in Harlan Creek was different now from the one it had been in the spring of 1878, when Lydia had stood beside her table with 12 unsold loaves and her chin up. The market was larger because the town had grown, and Lydia's stall was established enough that she had a regular spot and regular customers who came specifically for her and not just for the market generally. She still went every Saturday, though she no longer needed to, not for the income but because she liked the market itself, the particular community of it, and because the Saturday market was where her life had turned. Seth still came to the market with her, which by now was simply part of Saturday, part of the structure of the week. He helped set up the table and sometimes manned the stall, while Lydia was in conversation with another vendor. And occasionally, still, when he could see a lull approaching, he would quietly buy 2 or 3 loaves without being asked, and Lydia would look at him with the expression she had been giving him for 2 years, which was layered and warm and carried with it the entire history of what they were to each other. One Saturday in the summer of 1880, a young woman set up a new stall at the market, selling preserves and pickled goods, and she was clearly nervous and clearly new to the market, and the morning was not going well for her in the way that first mornings at the market did not go well. Lydia watched her from across the way for a while and then walked over and introduced herself, and suggested that the woman move her table slightly to catch the foot traffic from the main entrance better. And then she bought a jar of the apple preserves and said, loudly enough that nearby customers could hear, that they were excellent. Seth watched this from behind Lydia's stall, where he was handing change to a customer, and he felt something that was simultaneously very simple and very large, which was the recognition that he was watching the woman he loved do something she had learned from being on the receiving end of exactly the same grace. The young woman's name was Mary Dunlap, and she sold out her preserves by early afternoon, and she was back the following Saturday with twice the inventory and a confidence that had not been there the week before. She and Lydia became friends, the way frontier women built friendships, in the practical medium of shared work and mutual respect, and Mary's preserves eventually became part of the extended catalog of goods that the Wells Martinez bakery sold alongside its bread. In late 1880, Joseph Caldwell made good on the equity arrangement he and Seth had discussed 2 years before, formalizing it in a document that Pete Aldridge witnessed, and that the lawyer in town registered properly, giving Seth a real stake in the Caldwell Ranch operation, and a foreman's salary that was considerably more substantial than his previous wages. It was the materialization of the plan he had described to Lydia on the porch the night he proposed, and it felt, as he rode home from the lawyer's office with the document in his coat pocket, like the land beneath him had a different quality, not just something he worked, but something he was part of. He came home to find Lydia in the bakehouse with Thomas on her hip, the child having reached the stage of development where he needed to be wherever his mother was, and could be neither safely left alone nor permanently set down, a developmental phase that was simultaneously endearing and physically demanding. Seth took the boy, who went immediately from clinging to his mother to climbing Seth with the ease of long practice. "It's done," Seth said. "The paper's signed." Lydia set down the dough she had been working and looked at him. Thomas grabbed Seth's hat and put it on his own head where it settled over his eyes completely. "I always knew it would be," she said. "I know you did," he said, "but it's different when it's on paper." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Thomas said something emphatic from inside the hat, which was impossible to decipher but clearly important. They both looked at the hat, and then at each other, and laughed in the private, easy way of two people who have built a life together and find it, regularly, genuinely good. The winter of 1880 brought the kind of weather the mountains produced when they were serious about it, weeks of heavy snow and cold that kept most people closer to their hearths than they would have chosen. The bakehouse was warm, a significant domestic advantage, and Lydia baked through the whole season, the aroma of bread permeating the small house and becoming the smell of home in Thomas's early memory, woven into him so deeply that years later the smell of baking bread would always mean his mother and the warm winter house, and his father sitting at the kitchen table reading or working on the accounts. On a cold January evening that year, Seth was sitting at the kitchen table with the ranch account books when Lydia came in from the bakehouse and sat down across from him and said, in the manner of a woman delivering considered information, "I think there is going to be another baby." Seth put down his pencil. "October again?" he asked. "August," she said. "I think August." He smiled at that, the particular slow smile that was his best smile because it arrived at its own pace without any performance. "August is a good month," he said. "Most months are good for this purpose," she said, smiling back. The second child was a girl, born in August of 1881 as predicted, and she came into the world with a calm and a poise that made the doctor say he had rarely seen a baby who seemed so settled in herself from the first moment. They named her Clara, partly for the month and partly in honor of Clara Hoffman, who had been the first person in Harlan Creek to be genuinely kind to Lydia when she was a stranger in town, and who received the news of the naming with the combination of pleasure and dignified composure that characterized everything she did. Thomas received his sister with the authority of a 3-year-old who has been told he is now the older sibling and takes the responsibility seriously. He brought her bread, which was the highest offering he knew, and the family photograph that was taken that autumn by a traveling photographer who passed through Harlan Creek shows Seth and Lydia sitting close together, Thomas standing very straight beside his father with a solemn expression, and Clara in Lydia's arms looking at the world with the interested calm she had been born with. The photograph sat on the mantelpiece in the house on the edge of Harlan Creek for many years after, accumulating company as the years added things to the mantel: ribbons from bread competitions, a small piece of stone that Thomas found on the range when he was 7 and thought was significant, a flower dried from the garden that Clara pressed in a book, and then mounted in a tiny frame when she was old enough to do it herself. Rosa Martinez married a carpenter named Felipe 2 years after she became Lydia's partner, and the wedding was held in the yard behind the bakehouse, which was the most appropriate venue anyone could think of. And Seth built the arbor the couple stood under, and Lydia made the wedding bread, and Thomas, who was 4, ate 3 pieces of it and had to be carried home asleep. The town of Harlan Creek grew steadily through the early 1880s, drawn by the railroad spur that reached it in 1882 and opened the county to commerce in new ways. The railroad brought new people and new business, and Wells Martinez bread was among the early suppliers to the railroad dining arrangements, which was Lydia's doing, achieved through a combination of the quality of the product and the directness with which she presented herself to the railroad catering agent who came through town assessing local suppliers. The railroad agent, a precise man named Gentry from St. Louis, had not expected to find a bakery of this caliber in a small Colorado mountain town, and said so, and Lydia received the compliment without false modesty and without making too much of it, and named her price, which was fair, and they shook hands on a contract. Seth heard about this at supper that evening when Lydia told it with the factual ease of someone who had done a business thing and was reporting it. "The railroad," he said. "The railroad," she confirmed, passing him the bread basket with the slight smile that she used when she was pleased with something. "I think," he said, taking a piece, "that you were going to be fine long before I ever showed up at that market." She looked at him steadily. "Maybe," she said, "but fine is not the same as this. This is better than fine." He looked at her across the table, the warm kitchen around them. Thomas bent over something he was drawing on a piece of paper, Clara in her chair with the alert, considering look she always had, the smell of bread in the air and the lamplight on the walls, and he thought about the word fine and how completely inadequate it was for what he was looking at. "Yes," he said, "it is." They had been in Harlan Creek together for 4 years by then, and the life they had built was a visible thing, a structure with good bones and careful detail, and the warmth of 2 people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and kept choosing each other with the same clear intention. The bread was part of it, the ranch was part of it, the children and the neighbors and the Saturday market and the Thursday suppers and the porch in the evenings were all part of it, and none of it was accidental. The Saturday market that summer was held in the usual field, and on a morning in June that was everything a Colorado mountain summer morning should be. The air sharp and clean with the overnight cool not yet burned off. The sky a particular deep blue that seemed to have more depth than skies elsewhere. The mountains standing at the edge of the world as they always did, permanent and indifferent in the good way. The way that things which are much larger than your concerns give your concerns their proper proportion. Lydia's stall that morning had 16 loaves of the standard honey wheat, 8 of a new oat and molasses loaf that Rosa had developed over the winter, and 4 of a special sourdough that used a starter Lydia had been maintaining for 2 years. Seth was there at the table beside her, and Thomas was there too, at 7 years old, allowed to make change for simple transactions under his mother's eye, taking this responsibility with the seriousness he brought to everything. Clara, at 4, had been left with Mary Dunlap for the morning because 4-year-olds and market stalls did not always make a successful combination. Mary Dunlap's stall was across the square, and Clara had reportedly already organized the preserved jars by color, which was not technically useful but which Mary reported with the affection of a woman who appreciated initiative in small children. The widow Pelham stopped at the stall mid-morning, as she often did on Saturdays, and looked over the loaves with the eye of someone who still took competition seriously, even in the absence of active competition. "The oat and molasses is new," she observed. "Rose's recipe," Lydia said. "It's been very popular." "I imagine it has," the widow said, and picked one up and bought it, which was the highest compliment she could offer. Pete Aldridge came by at noon, no longer working for the Caldwell Ranch, having retired the previous year to a small house in town where he grew tomatoes with alarming success and visited the Copper Spur on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He was exactly as he had always been, which was the great comfort of people who are already entirely themselves. "Good market?" he asked Seth. "Very good," Seth said. "And everything else?" Pete said, with the emphasis that meant the question was broader. Seth looked at Lydia, who was talking to a customer, her hands moving as she described the difference between the two loaves, Thomas standing beside her watching the transaction with his small, attentive face. He looked at the market around them, the familiar faces and the summer light and the mountains at the edge of everything. "Everything else is very good," he said. Pete nodded, as though this confirmed something he had always expected. "I told you, that first Sunday when we went to help with the bakehouse. I said I understood. You said you understood why I bought all the bread. And I did understand," Pete said. "Some things are very simple when you get to the middle of them." Seth considered this. It was true that from the middle of things the shape was clearer. From the middle of the life he had now, the path that had led to it made a clean, logical line, from a first Saturday morning and a hand-painted sign, and a woman standing in the market with the patience of someone who knew what she had, and was willing to wait for the world to catch up with it. And him on the other side of a table, buying bread, buying time, buying himself closer to something he hadn't had the words for yet. "Some things are," he agreed. The afternoon of the market wound down in the usual way, the vendors packing up their goods, the foot traffic thinning toward the late hours, the children of the town who had been running loose all morning gradually being gathered back to their families. Thomas helped Lydia fold the tablecloth with the efficiency of a child who has done this many times and knows the precise way to do it, each fold meeting the one before it exactly, and Lydia praised him for it without overdoing the praise, which was her way. They loaded the wagon together, the four of them after Mary brought Clara back across the square, Clara still talking about the preserve jars and their new arrangement, which she described in comprehensive detail to Seth, who received the information as though it were significant, which to Clara it was. Seth lifted her into the wagon, and she settled immediately against his side with the compact confidence of a child who has never had any doubt about being held. And Thomas climbed up on the other side, and the two children flanked Seth in the wagon seat, while Lydia came around to check the load, and then climbed up herself with the ease of a woman who had been doing this for years. The road from town to their property was not long, and the late afternoon light was on the hills, that particular gold that Colorado afternoons made in summer, and the smell of the sage that grew along the road came up as the wagon wheels passed over it, and the horse moved at the easy pace of an animal who knew the way home and was content to take it. Clara fell asleep against Seth's arm before they had gone half a mile, which was her habit, the energy of the day collapsing all at once into sleep with the efficiency only children managed. Thomas, still awake, asked a question about the mountains that Seth answered at length, and then asked a second question, and Lydia listened to the two of them talking while the wagon moved through the summer evening and thought about all the things she had been holding in her hands in the past years. The bread and the business and the house and the children and the marriage and the community of it. All of it built one Saturday at a time, one loaf at a time, one conversation at a time. And how none of it had been guaranteed, but all of it had been possible, and how the difference between possible and actual was usually the people you were lucky enough to find. She looked at Seth's profile beside her, the familiar angles of it, the way he was listening to Thomas with his complete attention, and she put her hand on his arm in the same gesture she had made that day at the market, the same deliberate, simple touch. He did not look at her, but he covered her hand with his and held it there. The mountains were doing something complicated with the light above them, going purple at the top and gold at the middle, and staying green at the bottom where the trees were, all of it enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small human drama of a wagon coming home from market. It was a good indifference, the kind that made you feel free. In the years that followed, the life of Seth and Lydia Vaughn became one of those things that a community uses as a reference point, a standard, something to gesture toward when people asked what was possible. Not in the sense of wealth or fame, but in the sense of the life that two people could build from honesty and work, and the willingness to be kind to each other in the specific and daily way that kindness actually required, not the grand gesture but the consistent small one. The loaves bought so a woman would not go home with a full wagon, the bakehouse rebuilt on 3 Sundays, the hand held in the wagon on the road home. Thomas grew into a young man who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and when he was 16, he began working part-time at the Caldwell Ranch under his father's supervision. And there was in the way Seth showed him the work something that the other hands noticed and respected, the particular care of a man teaching his son something he genuinely loved. Clara grew into a young woman with her mother's instincts and her own particular quality, an artist's eye that found beauty in unexpected places, and she began to draw the valley and the mountains and the market and the people of Harlan Creek in pencils and eventually watercolors. And the sketches she made of the bakehouse and the market stall and the Saturday mornings were so exact and so warm that Lydia had them framed, and they hung on the walls of the house alongside the family photograph. Rosa and Felipe had 3 children of their own, and the bakery expanded twice more, requiring a 3rd baker and eventually a small delivery wagon of its own. And the sign above the bakehouse door that had once read only Wells Bread in Lydia's hand-painted letters was replaced with a proper painted sign that said Wells and Martinez Bakers, established 1878. And the 1878 was Lydia's idea, because she wanted the record to show that it had started in the first year she was there, when it was just her and a table and a hand-painted sign and a patient faith in the quality of what she made. The Saturday market in Harlan Creek continued to be the heartbeat of the week, and Lydia's stall continued to be there every Saturday morning, well into the 1880s and beyond, and Seth continued to be there beside it, and the regulars of the market had the particular comfort of some things being where you expected them, week after week, the way good things should be. On a Saturday in October of 1885, which was the 7th anniversary of the first Saturday Lydia had set up her stall at the market, Seth arrived in the pre-dawn dark to help her load the wagon and found her already in the bakehouse checking the morning's loaves, the lamp making everything warm and gold inside, the smell surrounding her the way it always did. He stood in the bakehouse door and watched her for a moment before she heard him. She was running her hand along the top of the closest loaf with the same attention she had always brought to it, checking the crust by touch, a gesture so practiced it had become a kind of conversation with the bread itself. "Morning," he said. She looked up and smiled. "You're early. Couldn't sleep," he said. "The anniversary. You remembered." "I always remember," he said. 7 years ago today you set up a table at the market and I stood on the other side of it and bought a loaf of bread and had my life entirely rearranged by the experience." She laughed, which was still, 7 years in, the best sound in his world. "That's a romantic way to describe buying bread." "It's an accurate way," he said. She crossed the bakehouse and stood in front of him, and he was the same Seth Vaughn he had always been, weather-lined and steady, with the particular quality of a man who was entirely comfortable with who he was, and she was the same Lydia Wells she had always been, direct and clear-eyed and full of a warmth that she had never needed to manufacture because it was original. 7 years, she said. 7 good years, he said. "Very good," she agreed, and leaned up and kissed him in the lamplight of the bakehouse she had built with his help, surrounded by the bread that was her livelihood and her craft, and the thing that had first told him what kind of woman she was. Outside, the October morning was beginning to lighten at the edges, the mountains going from black to deep blue to the pale gray that preceded the coming of the sun, and the town of Harlan Creek was waking in its usual way, the smith lighting his forge, the roosters doing their work, the smoke beginning to rise from chimneys where people were making their fires against the autumn cold. Thomas, who was 9 and had inherited his father's inability to sleep late when something was happening, appeared at the bakehouse door in his coat and hat with the expression of a child who had come to be included and was prepared to argue for it. "Can I come to market?" he asked. "You come every Saturday," Lydia said. "I know, but today I want to make the first sale myself. You can watch." Seth and Lydia looked at each other with the shared amusement of two people raising a child who was, at 9, more certain about what he wanted than most adults they knew. "You can make the first sale," Seth said, "but your mother sets the prices and I'll be there if you need help with the change." "I won't need help with the change," Thomas said, with the certainty of a boy who had been sitting with the accounts since he was old enough to understand them. "I've been practicing." "I know you have," Seth said. "Get your sister up." Clara was at 7, capable of sleeping through anything, a skill that seemed like an injustice when you were the one who had to wake her. Thomas went to perform this service with the resigned competence of an older sibling, and Seth helped Lydia carry the first of the loaves out to the wagon, and the morning assembled itself around them the way mornings did, piece by piece, ordinary and extraordinary at once. The road to the market that morning had frost on it, the first frost of the season, and the wagon wheels crunched through it softly, and Clara, fully awake now with the cold air, pointed at the frost with delight as though she were personally responsible for inventing it. Thomas explained the science of it to her in a way that was largely correct and entirely confident, and Seth drove the horse and Lydia sat beside him with her shoulder against his. And the mountains stood around them in the early light doing what mountains do, which is to exist on a scale that puts everything else in proportion without diminishing any of it. At the market, Thomas set up the stall with a seriousness that drew affectionate attention from the nearby vendors, who had known him since he was small enough to stand behind the table and peer over the edge of it. He arranged the loaves with the same care his mother always took, each one positioned so its best side was forward, the cloth folded neatly underneath, the sign angled to catch the eye from the main path. The first customer of the morning was Clara Hoffman, who was by now in her 60s but still the first person at the market every Saturday, holding to the habit of decades. She stopped at Lydia's stall as she always did and looked down at Thomas behind the table with the warmth of someone who had watched a child grow from nothing. "Good morning," she said. "What will it be this morning?" "The honey wheat is very good today," Thomas said, with absolute confidence. "The oat and molasses is also excellent, but the wheat has been particularly well proofed, and the crust on it is very even. I watched my mother make it." Clara Hoffman looked at the boy and then at Lydia and Seth behind him, who were both working very hard to maintain neutral expressions. "I'll take 2 of the honey wheat," she said. Thomas made change with the precision he had promised, and Clara Hoffman took her bread and said to Lydia, "He's going to be just fine, that one." "I know," Lydia said. The morning moved as Saturday mornings moved, in the good, productive rhythm of the market in full swing, the town of Harlan Creek doing its weekly commerce in the way of a community that had found its stride. Rosa was at her end of the stall with her own section, their operation by now large enough to require the full table and then some, and Felipe sat nearby with their youngest, and the combined household of their 2 families was a warm and complicated thing that filled the market space with a life that was more than the sum of its parts. Seth stood at the edge of it all for a moment, watching, and Pete Aldridge appeared at his elbow with the timing of a man who had always known when to show up. "Good anniversary," Pete said. Seth looked at him. "How do you know about the anniversary?" "Because I remember the first Saturday she was here," Pete said. I was at this market back corner, and I saw you standing in front of her stall for the first time, and I thought, well, that man is going to buy some bread and get himself into a great deal of happiness." "That's not exactly what you said at the time," Seth said. "I thought it," Pete said with dignity. "The saying comes later. The thinking is the important part." Seth looked back at the stall, where Lydia was talking to a customer, and Thomas was listening with the focused attention he brought to everything, and Clara was trying to organize the remaining loaves in a way that was artistically interesting rather than commercially practical, and the market moved around all of them in its usual Saturday way. "Yes," Seth said, mostly to himself. "It does." The October sun was fully up now, burning the frost off the road and warming the market field to the particular temperature of a good autumn morning, bright and clear, and carrying that sharpness that meant the summer was honestly gone, and the season ahead was honest too. The mountains at the edge of the valley were doing something complicated with the autumn light, the aspen on their slopes having gone gold already, a shifting line of yellow and orange that moved in the morning wind. Lydia looked up from her customer and found Seth across the stall, and for a moment it was the same thing it had always been, two people looking at each other with the clear recognition of two people who had found the thing they were looking for. The recognition never wore off. That was the thing about it. 7 years in, the Saturday market in October, the children and the bread and the mountains and the frost still on the road, and it was the same clear recognition it had been on a porch in the dark, on a Wednesday afternoon when the bakehouse was burning, on a first Saturday morning when a man had walked up to a table and asked how much for a loaf. She smiled at him, and he smiled back, and Thomas made another sale with great authority, and Clara rearranged the bread again, and the market went on being the market, and Harlan Creek went on being Harlan Creek, and the mountains went on being what the mountains had always been, enormous and patient and full of the particular indifference that gives the small human world its proper proportion and does not, by doing so, make it any smaller. It made it, in fact, exactly the right size. The size of a bakehouse and a market stall, and a house with a vegetable garden, and a ranch on good land, and 2 children who were going to be exactly who they were. The size of a life built one honest thing at a time, starting with bread bought so a woman would not go home with a full wagon, continuing through everything that came after, ending nowhere yet because the story of it was still being made, Saturday by Saturday, morning by morning, all the way forward into whatever the world would offer next. And whatever that was, they would meet it together.